At conferences like these, we like to reflect on the hot topics of the time. But I think that right now is a really good opportunity to do a little bit of a retrospective. As Lisa mentioned in the beginning of her presentation, when the pandemic got kicked off, everybody got comfortable with telehealth really instantaneously. We figured out how to pay for it. We figured out how to engage with it. But it's been 5 years since. And so I think that it's time for us to do a little bit of a retrospective and figure out, did telehealth survive the pandemic? Lessons in remote care. So I'd like to invite our moderator, Patrick Callaghan, to the stage to invite the rest of the telehealth panel up.
Yeah, first of all, a big thank you to Matthew and the entire UCLA technical development team. What an operation. Very impressive. So I can welcome to the stage and then we'll go sit over there. So first we have Greg Buchert, who is the CEO of Makani Science, a continuous ventilation monitoring company. You can come on up, as I say. And then we're also going to have Jason Halac, who is the co-founder and managing director of Dexcom Ventures, which has a deep focus on remote patient monitoring, which, even though this kind of generally is about telehealth, we're going to do a lot of focusing on remote patient monitoring today. And then finally, Dr. David Cho, who is here at UCLA and was instrumental in the adoption of telehealth during the pandemic, and has continued to be active in writing papers and kind of how that has continued to be a part of our day-to-day lives. So I will sit. Is it on? Hello? It's on? Yeah. Perfect. Well, big thank you to everybody for joining today. Obviously, we only have 30 minutes and, there's a lot to cover, and did telehealth survive the pandemic? But I'd first like to start with you, Dr. Cho. How do you see, I guess, obviously, retrospectively, but today, how do you see RPM and telehealth still being used in your practice?
Sure. No, right here. Well, first, I just wanted to thank the promoters at LABEST for inviting us and having this thoughtful discussion. I think to answer the question about where we're at with telehealth and RPM, I still think it's a pretty fragmented market, which is very tailored to specific use cases. And telehealth is, I believe, also having a similar moment to where the early EHR systems were, where ultimately a lot of the end users are the patients and the physicians, but ultimately these systems are sold to either the administrators of a large practice or a healthcare system. And so there is still that sort of disconnect in which you have to derive value from it and how it fits into your operating budget, et cetera, but how it also sort of fits into the clinical workflows as well. So
have you found that, I guess either in your practice or your colleagues, that there are certain types of remote patient monitoring that have been more effective or more kind of useful than others?
Well, as a cardiologist, most of the RPMs I get involved with are usually either blood pressure related or potentially heart failure related. I'll at least say at our system, there's been a huge push, not just at UCLA, but across all the UCs to better improve hypertension control. So there have been a lot of remote management RPM programs dedicated to tackling hypertension, particularly against disparities. And a lot of these are not necessarily involving the physician. They're either nurse-led or pharmacy-led. And so is a big push from the UC president to adapt and treat this population problem.
And this, I guess, kind of starting with Greg, but certainly anybody can chime in. I think that, we've found, and it always was like data. The more you can get, the better. But how have you found, I guess, Greg, in the products that you guys are producing, or in Jason, in the products that you guys are investing in, that how the most effective products are able to take this giant pool of data and able to effectively use it for practical application?
I think the big things are making sure that while there is a lot of data, finding out what are panic values, something that people really need to know, versus trends that may show some change. And I think one of the biggest challenges is how to communicate that and to whom to communicate that to. Some is to the patient for self-management. I think that there's increasing amounts of empowerment to patients to take care of themselves. And, I think one of the failures of so many of the programs with remote patient management has been practices getting overwhelmed with information, that there's so much, you just get information fatigue and stop paying attention. And so it's how do you filter that to make it really, really crisp and information that somebody can respond to. And yet, from a payer perspective, it's also a matter of with Medicare providing reimbursement for remote patient monitoring, do we give enough for them to help manage a patient?
Yeah, and just adding there a little bit, I think what we see in the things that we're investing in and kind of just our view of the landscape is a lot of these, especially post-pandemic, accesses to different sets of data have been incredibly useful. And then getting those expectations of how data is gathered and where it's gathered is also really useful for the patient as well as the chronic disease management side of the world. So having these longitudinal sets of data that aren't so disruptive to the patient experience and how those data sets can be gathered and then put into a business model that makes sense for both the clinicians, the systems, as well as the device makers through the reimbursement channels and things like that. Making those models work have really evolved, I'd say, over the last couple of years.
Dr. Cho, I know that Greg kind of alluded to this information fatigue, and I know you often hear with like alarm fatigue and stuff like that. Have you put kind of, protections in place to make sure that kind of when you're utilizing different forms of remote patient monitoring that you're able to kind of combat that fatigue and be alert to the things that you need to be alert to and not allow kind of some of the noise to distract you from what you should be looking for?
Sure, certainly. I think there's definitely clinical inertia. Once you get people onboarded, once getting over that activation barrier is the first hump to get over. And I think, with, making things easier for the physician or for the nurse practitioner or for the pharmacist, whomever, so that they only need to click in one area. I think one of the barriers to even getting people on RPM solutions is, all the checklist things that need to go on, and then you need to search for the data, then you need to review the data, then you need to remember the building code. So there's not, even in our current workflow, there's not like an easy button, like here's all the stuff in the CPT code, it's all dropped for you. But I think that's honestly where a lot of AI can help with a lot of this consolidation. There's a lot of platforms coming out there that are, vendor agnostic and are able to use AI to help sort the data into a one-stop shop to make it easier to make it a billable code, yet review all the data. I think sort of that's the future state. The current state of where we're really at is, we live and breathe in the EHR, which Epic is what we use at UCLA Health, and how you can get that data in front of one, where people work is, for at least for the hypertension, the blood pressure readings all need to go into the flow sheets so that you can see the trend visualization. We don't need fancy external software to see that. We just need to see it within where all our decisions are made: orders, data review, patient messaging, etc.
Jace,
I was going to say, yeah, just echoing that. I think we heard that a little bit too this morning with Lisa's talking about kind of how the data is displayed in dashboarding and moving those things into the systems that the physicians are already comfortable with and using. And again, just the inertia that has pushed us towards that direction, but also kind of the balancing act of dealing with both from the clinician and reader of this EHR information and how they're digesting the information, but also on the device maker side of like how you're publishing that information and interacting with that information and having access to that information to get into the EHR has also been a challenge for the device maker side of the world. So we've seen those evolve to be better. They're not great as it stands right now, and having these visualizations and access and custom integrations with all the different EHRs as well as different systems having different integrations, there's not yet uniformity there.
And I'm sure that you could speak for 20 minutes on this question, but what are some of the kind of the things that, as you're looking at potential opportunities, that you view as characteristics that would make some of these devices be stickier, both for serving the needs of the providers, but also serving the needs of the patients as well?
Yeah, some of the things we're looking for are really just one, meeting a clinical need. Gathering data just to gather data without providing kind of a direct use case of how this is going to be applicable or actionable to the user's care is not really what we're interested in. We want to do impactful disease management with this data gathering tool set. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it, is like thinking through not just the data you're collecting, whether that's, just health signals like PPG and EEG and other kind of non-invasive signals that are kind of commonly collected by these RPM devices, but how you're using that for disease management and how you're taking that and presenting it to the end users, be that the clinicians or the patients themselves, to be actionable.
And Greg, I guess kind of a similar question. What are the types of things, as you guys are developing your remote patient monitoring products, what are kind of the 2 to 3 things that you're really thinking about. Okay, if we want to have an effective product that is, again, serving the needs of everybody that exists in that chain, what are the certain things that that need to be there, or that you've seen as you kind of look through the market as competitors or people or products in other industries that you've seen are kind of those things that could lead to success and that stickiness?
Sure. No, it's ironic that we're sitting here next to the continuous glucose monitor, because we're developing a continuous respiratory monitor. And a couple of things that we're looking at are, one is getting information that's real time, continuous and real time, and useful for the patient. I think number one. 2 is communicating information to a device that can be used by a clinician, whether it be a nurse, a physician, researcher, pharma. And 3 is collecting that indexed information by disease, by category in the cloud, with the goal of being able to, and some people may not be aware that there's a real-time waveform that can be generated by breathing, and analyzing that to eventually be able to predict, prevent, and intervene in the event of any kind of respiratory deterioration. So it becomes very useful and actionable, even in a real-time state, or hopefully changing some therapies when there are trends that are identified.
And so kind of bringing it back to you, Dr. Ches. So we have this great product then, and it checks all those boxes. What are some of the things that you see, maybe some of the behavioral barriers that you have to get as far as making sure that the patients are actually utilizing these products in a way that can be helpful to you and reliable in the data that they produce?
So I think one of the major questions that people don't ask is, do they need to be monitored forever, right? So a lot of what we do from the more intensive hypertension control, or probably in the glucose world as well with the continuous glucose, is let's get them quickly to therapy, to goal, and then enter a maintenance phase so that you can continue to have new onboarding. I think a lot of these solutions are sort of, well, just they can be on this forever. And just like any piece of technology, you'll probably interact with it most as soon as you get it, and then your use will sort of taper off over time. So I think maybe being able to identify a time course about how long someone should be managed and when to sort of, catch and release kind of strategy is a larger strategy that people need to consider.
Changing gears a bit, as I alluded to, Greg is obviously now in the business of creating these monitoring products, but it has a history working on kind of the payer side as well. From the payer's point of view, what are the types of conditions that, health conditions that a payer would maybe view as the most ripe for kind of implementing RPM to help with the care in that area?
From a payer perspective, there's typically the 4 big diseases that generate the most cost. And those are asthma, COPD, congestive heart failure, and diabetes. And even though there's really high cost diseases like some of the cancers or transplants or things like that, on a day-to-day basis, it's those 4 diseases that drive people to an emergency department that result in hospitalization. So anywhere where there's any kind of telehealth that supports that is important. And I think it's important as we think about telehealth is that there's just so many various areas. It could be anything from e-consults where a primary care provider can contact a specialist to say, well, what do I do in this case? Sometimes there's going to be the face-to-face interaction that occurs and paying for that. And I can tell you, when I started Centene's first health plan in California, and we spent 6 months finding out why so many telehealth programs failed. And, because I was serving rural and frontier counties in California, along that whole eastern spine, and we were paying for transporting people 200 and 300 miles. And so one of the biggest challenges that we had was finding the specialists that could do those face-to-face visits with a patient, because we had things like Teledoc and MD Live and other things like that for those kind of real-time interactions. But it was really to find a group like Telemed2U that we contracted with that had all the specialists covered across the country to provide that information. So I think those are all the important things, is that's not a one-size-fits-all, but I'd say really focus on those 4 diseases.
Do you think, or are there certain metrics that would lead to these payers being more apt to continue to provide coverage for certain types of RPM?
And it's, it's interesting when I'm always honest and transparent about the payer world. And when I think about it, it's all about members and money. And so when RPM can produce a positive return on investment where a payer is going to make more money or save more money than they're paying for the product, that's always one of the things to convince them. And I always say that when anybody's pitching to a health plan, there's, the medical people are the easiest ones to convince because they're going to understand the clinical implications. But it's going to be the three people that control the resources in the health plan, and that's the chief financial officer, the chief human resource officer, and the chief information officer. And so all those things need to be considered as you're approaching a plan.
And David, how have you seen, or I guess, have you seen there be an evolution in kind of how open to accepting, RPM and other forms of telehealth that the payers have been compared to obviously the pandemic when, this was widely accepted, so many waivers, flexibilities that were there. Do you notice that they are moving away from being as open to providing coverage for some of these, or does it kind of seem like it's much of the same?
Where Medicare goes, usually the rest of the payers go as well. At least the codes that were inserted and expanded in 2020, to my knowledge, are still there and potentially expanding. I know that there's always every 6 months they keep pushing out the budget about whether telehealth will continue to be covered or not, which is a huge component as well. But I think, going back to sort of the ROI and the strategy, I think one thing that I've noticed in the last year or so is like telehealth use is probably leveled off. 15-ish% of all encounters are telehealth, and now we've sort of operationally moved to batching them. With some providers who want more flexibility, they can work off-site, which frees up more patient rooms in office to see those sick people, more patients, and you can get more patients, more throughput, more access, yet still have high-quality care delivered with or without RPM, obviously augmented with RPM. So, my Monday mornings are telehealth, and I'm usually doing chronic hypertension, heart failure, kind of stable heart failure management, which is telehealth plus or minus RPM, not an enterprise solution. But that has freed up our office to bring on a new provider with the limited rooms we have and improve access times as well. So it's sort of a potential selling point or a potential positive gain from telehealth that we may not have necessarily seen at the beginning of the pandemic.
Jason, changing tracks a bit here. What do you see kind of taking the perspective of these potential startups that maybe are trying to get into the telehealth space or RPM or, some combination of the two? What do you think is kind of the hardest thing or the biggest barrier to creating an end-to-end RPM solution? If you're sitting in the audience and you feel like you might have an RPM solution, what do you think are kind of the biggest barrier that you would have to overcome to get kind of the type of utilization where you're working with the people that are up on the stage here?
Yeah, it's a hard one. So there are, I think, is kind of finding, it's kind of like the biodesign, which we see out here, kind of ethos of trying to find the problem statement and solving that problem statement. I think is really kind of the core to the biggest challenge of what they're trying to accomplish kind of across the board. And so I think probably as you're thinking about RPM type solutions, what you're really trying to figure out is what is the business model that gets this data generation to be useful? What problem are you solving? And can you demonstrate that? So it's showing the clinical evidence that whatever solution you're providing has a clinical benefit, and then figuring out how it's going to get reimbursed or paid for or drive efficiency in the system to show that it's being effectively used. And I think, kind of stepping back just a second, efficiency is kind of where telehealth, I think, started, where the origination of having a video call or even a telephone, like right remote. But having a remote call so that the physicians could access people or patients at the point of need, becoming more efficient in just travel time and access. I think RPM on the data side is also about efficiency. It's collecting data where other times it couldn't have been collected before. And I think where things are starting to go now is in kind of the application. And how you got to mention AI in a panel, right? So how AI can take these data sets and make them actionable. So I've heard it now labeled remote patient intervention, RPI. So how we're kind of, again, putting these pieces together. So it's not waiting for somebody to initiate these interactions, but having the system itself initiate the interactions.
Do you think in particular with health systems or hospitals, do you think that there's anything that they, again, in your experience in the companies that you've worked with, that they sometimes get wrong when they're evaluating potential opportunities, where you think that, maybe a company that you're working with you think has great potential, but for whatever reason they're having a hard time getting into some of these health systems? Is there, something that you think that perhaps a perspective that some of these large health systems are not taking as far as seeing the utility of some of these RPM devices?
Yeah, I mean, as an investor, I of course want people to adopt the products as quickly as possible. So, all the time is the answer. There's a company that we've invested in that's it's doing EEG for epilepsy monitoring, and they're going through the commercialization process right now of just figuring out. There already are CPT codes that they can bill for this kind of services, but how they're selling into providers and clinics, and how they're getting showing those clinics that their solution is effective and it can be adopted, and more importantly, that they can get reimbursed. It's actually going to be a big hurdle, even though they have these codes, of actually demonstrating that they're getting reimbursed and who's paying for it and who's at risk for these dollars is a huge problem.
Greg, obviously, I guess you can kind of opine on a similar question, but somewhat related. What have you seen for products or in products that you're developing? What do you think are things that can be done early in the cycle to prove that utility to, I guess, certainly any buyer, but health systems in particular? What are some of the characteristics that you can display at early stages that show that you may have some lasting effect?
I'd say the couple things are going to be, is there a large enough market? Do you have a product that's differentiated enough from the status quo that people are willing to change? And physicians are pretty reluctant to move away from where they've been. Hospitals are reluctant to add one more item to their, to the plethora of things that they procure. And so I think thinking about the business side of it, but also the importance of the ease of use, I think being culturally sensitive, making sure that if you've got something that has any kind of language or communication aspect of it, it has to be usable by a population. Here we are in Los Angeles when we ran the Blue Shield plan, we had to communicate everything in 12 languages. Having something just to communicate in Spanish and Vietnamese, or Spanish and English anymore, isn't enough. And so I think it's keeping that customer in mind, and making sure that there's a market need and demand and acceptance.
And so just a couple last questions here, just kind of on a look forward, and then we'll leave a couple minutes for questions here at the end. This is for everyone. What would you say, and we can start down here with you, Dr. Cho, what would you say is something that you're optimistic about with RPM and telehealth for the next, say, 3 to 5 years? Recognizing, as you alluded to, that we continue to get these 6-month extensions, but who knows when maybe those won't continue.
I think what I'm most optimistic about is this. Hopefully it does stick around. And I think the combination of making that data actionable, identifying a baseline and people who drift from there. I think that's the key point. How do you make things actionable? Like a patient can, if I'm incentivized and I get an RPM solution, I can keep billing for that, but I'm not really held accountable for whether I actually achieve that outcome. But if I have a risk-bearing contract and a certain number of my patients need to meet a certain metric, then you can use that data to make it actionable. So it really ends up how you're steering it. And I really think that sifting through all that data is something where AI is really going to make the biggest impact.
Jason?
Yeah, I think just making sure workflow works for everybody. Clinicians aren't going to want to take, they don't have any more time in their day. So making sure that the workflow works for the providers and that the ecosystem supports the reimbursement in those channels.
I'm most optimistic about patients being willing to use it. I think that there's less and less of a tolerance of waiting 2 or 3 months to get into a doctor's office, waiting 2 or 3 hours to be seen by that doctor, and the ability to get something real time now, and that it's actionable, and that there's tools to take care of ourselves, whether it be a phone call with your doc, one form of telehealth, or something on your smartphone. I think the the patient engagement is expanding, and I'm really optimistic about that.
And then I guess one last one from me, and then I'll open it up to probably more interesting questions from the people coming out there. But what do you think is kind of the biggest shift that you think is necessary in order for RPM and telehealth to reach its full potential, whether that be a technological shift or a cultural shift? What would be the one thing that you think, one change that you think would be the most beneficial in kind of propelling things forward?
From a practice standpoint, I mean, this mythical value-based care, population health, would be the biggest shift to make, I believe, RPM and the most valuable, because you're going to go from one-off to sudden just managing a population of patients with all this reams of data and being able to sort through and see who, like, your population or your herd is, like, well tended to. If that ever becomes the true incentive change about how we practice, that would be the most impactful. But it's been around the corner for the last 10 years. So,
Jason?
Yeah, I'll double up on that one. Yeah, just 100%. So, right now we have a lot of point solutions, Dexcom being one of them in diabetes care, but more specifically, even just glucose monitoring, and thinking about how that moves from an acute disease management that's like very targeted towards like a system level management of identifying folks that in that preventative care category that really can benefit from these tools.
I'd like to see more closed loop systems. And when I think about diabetes, where you're able to A, know your blood sugar, B, regulate your insulin, is a great example of what could be done with other telehealth activities. And again, it's as much as we can empower patients to take care of themselves is great, but it still needs the guidance and direction under a medical model as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Does anybody, and now we have, I guess, 4 or 5 minutes left here. Does anyone from the audience have any questions for any of the panelists up here? If not, that's okay.
Yes. Are we looking at any insulin tracking tools? Yes, we invest all across diabetes, and insulin would be incredibly helpful and useful for some of these algorithms that are doing the closed loop controls. So we're looking at it. The challenge is insulin concentrations that are circulating through the body make it a really challenging biosensor. So if there's any startups here that are enabling that, I'd love to hear the pitch.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. If you have any questions, obviously, please feel free to come up to us after the talk. But thank you so much to all the panelists. We really, really appreciate it. And again, thank you to the UCLA team for putting on such a great event here. Thank you.